Snow fell in thick, voiceless sheets, swallowing the world in white. A young woman staggered through it, hair tangled with frost, dress ripped and dark with soot. The wind gnawed at her bones. She had no gloves, no sense of direction, only a single thought: keep moving. Somewhere in the whiteness, smoke rose faintly from a chimney. She stumbled toward it as though following a ghost. When she reached the small cabin, she could barely lift her arm to knock. Her knuckles brushed the wooden door once, twice, and the sound vanished into the storm. The third time, the door opened before she could fall. A figure filled the frame, bare skin against the cold, long white hair tied loosely behind him. His chest gleamed with the dull firelight behind him, and the scars that ran across it seemed older than the land itself. His eyes, black as riverstone, studied her in silence. "I lost my family today," she gasped, voice breaking into a whisper. "Please, can you give me shelter for tonight?" The man didn't move for a moment. Snow gathered on her shoulders, the flakes melting into tears she didn't know she still had left. Then, wordlessly, he stepped aside. She hesitated, half expecting the door to close again, but it didn't. She crossed the threshold and collapsed near the hearth, the smell of wood smoke hitting her lungs like a memory. The warmth was almost cruel. It reminded her of what she'd had that morning: a husband laughing beside a wagon, her little sisters singing under the gray sky, their dog barking at birds. Then, gunfire. Screams. A wagon burning. She had run until her feet bled, following nothing but fear and snow. And now, here she was, shivering before a stranger who looked like a ghost carved from winter itself. He shut the door behind her and returned to the fire, lifting a small kettle with calm precision. The silence between them was not empty. It was thick, living, like the snow pressing against the windows. He poured hot broth into a tin bowl, and set it on the floor beside her without looking directly at her. She reached for it with trembling fingers, whispering, "Thank you." The man nodded once. He spoke at last, his voice low and rough as gravel. "Eat." The broth scalded her lips, but she didn't stop. It was the first taste of life she'd had since morning. When she was finished, he handed her a fur blanket, buffalo hide, heavy and warm. She tried to speak again, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Her name was Naomi Whitford, she wanted to say. Her husband's name was Eli. They had come west chasing a dream that ended in smoke. But to speak it aloud would make it too real. He sat across from her, near the fire. The light flickered across his face, revealing deep lines etched by years of sun and grief. The cabin was sparse. No woman's touch, no decoration, only weapons on the wall and dried herbs hanging from a beam. A wolf's skull rested above the doorway, and Naomi's eyes caught on it with unease. She swallowed. "You live alone?" she asked softly. He gave no answer, only glanced at the fire. Outside, wind howled like a dying horse. Naomi pulled the blanket tighter. "I didn't mean to intrude," she murmured, staring at the flames. I couldn't walk anymore." He turned his gaze to her then, steady, unblinking. "You won't walk tonight." She looked away, uncertain whether that was kindness or command. He rose to his full height, towering even in stillness. From a shelf, he took down a small wooden bowl, scooped something that smelled of sage and pine, and set it near the fire to burn. Smoke rose in thin spirals. "Rest," he said. Naomi's hands tightened on the blanket. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to stay awake in case he changed his mind, in case this was a trick or a test. But her body had other ideas. The heat, the smell of burning sage, and the low hum of the wind against the logs pulled her downward. Before she closed her eyes, she saw him kneel beside the fire, hands clasped, lips moving in a language she didn't know. A prayer, or maybe a memory. When she woke, the storm had softened. Gray morning seeped through the small window, illuminating the dust floating in the air. Her dress had dried beside the fire, her shoes cleaned and set neatly by the door. The man was gone. Panic surged for a moment before she heard the rhythmic crack of an axe outside. She stepped to the doorway, holding the blanket close. He stood bare-chested again in the snow, swinging the axe into a log with measured force. His breath misted in the cold, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every strike was part of an old ritual. His white hair glimmered in the faint sun. Naomi watched him for a long time before whispering, almost to herself, "Thank you." He didn't look up but replied, "You should eat." She found a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth on the table. She broke it, the warmth surprising her, and took a small bite. For the first time in days, her hands weren't shaking. She stared at the small objects around the cabin, woven baskets, carved figures, a cracked mirror. There was no softness, no laughter, only the quiet discipline of a man who lived apart from the world. When he came back inside, his presence filled the room. She forced herself to speak. "What's your name?" "Taji," he said simply. She nodded. "Naomi." He gave a faint nod, as if the name meant something old and heavy. Snow drifted against the window again. She sat near the fire, tracing patterns on her skirt, feeling her heart slow for the first time since she'd seen death. He began to prepare another meal. Simple, steady movements that reminded her of her father chopping wood back home. For a moment, it almost felt safe. Then, faintly in the distance, she heard hooves. At first she thought it was the wind, but Taji froze mid-motion. His eyes darkened. Without a word, he set the pot down and moved to the window, standing perfectly still. Naomi rose, fear prickling through her exhaustion. "What is it?" she whispered. He lifted a hand, signaling silence. The hoofbeats drew closer, muffled by snow, but distinct. 2 riders, maybe 3. Naomi's breath caught. Her mind leapt back to the fire, the screaming, the faces of the men who had killed her husband. Her knees weakened. Taji turned to her, eyes sharp. "Stay inside," he said. She clutched the blanket. "If they're the same men." "They won't come here," he interrupted, his tone calm but final. "But—" He looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression made her stop. It wasn't cruelty, it was certainty, the kind carved into stone by a lifetime of storms. He opened the door and stepped outside into the snow, unarmed, bare shoulders gleaming under the pale light. Naomi watched from the doorway, the wind catching her hair as the riders appeared over the hill, dark shapes against the endless white. She could feel her heart in her throat. Taji stood unmoving, a figure of quiet defiance. The riders slowed when they saw him, uncertain. He said nothing, made no gesture of threat, but the air around him seemed to shift, still as the world before lightning. After a long silence, the men turned their horses and rode away, swallowed by the falling snow. Naomi exhaled only when he came back inside. His expression hadn't changed. He shut the door gently behind him. "They won't return," he said. She looked at him, at the calm authority in his voice, and asked quietly, "Why did they leave?" He stirred the fire with a stick, eyes reflecting its glow. "Because they remember," he murmured. "Remember what?" He looked at her then, the corner of his mouth barely moving. "Who I used to be." The fire popped, scattering small sparks across the stone floor. Naomi held her breath, realizing she had sought shelter not just from the cold, but in the home of a man once feared by everyone beyond these hills. And as snow whispered against the cabin walls, she wasn't sure whether she'd been saved, or chosen. The morning broke silver over the snowfields. Naomi woke to the sound of firewood crackling, and the faint scrape of metal. Taji sharpening a blade outside. The air inside the cabin was warm, but her breath still clouded as she rose. Her fingers brushed the fur blanket, and for a moment she simply watched the smoke twist upward, the smell of pine and ash grounding her in this strange new stillness. The fear that had carried her here began to unravel into something quieter. Confusion, maybe, or the ache of being alive when others weren't. When she stepped outside, the light startled her. The world stretched white and endless, each flake catching the dawn. Taji stood at the edge of the clearing, bare arms streaked with scars that caught the morning like pale lightning. His white hair moved in the wind. He turned when he heard her, lowering the blade into the snow. "You should stay inside," he said. Naomi shook her head faintly. "I've been inside too long." He looked at her a long time, saying nothing. There was no impatience in his gaze, just that same silence that seemed to weigh the air itself. She bent to gather a piece of firewood, her movements clumsy in the cold. He watched her stack the wood crookedly, then came to correct her grip without a word. His large hands closed around hers, steadying them. His touch was rough but careful, like someone used to handling things that break easily. "I can help," she said, softly defiant. He nodded once, stepped back, and let her continue. By noon the sky had darkened again, and the wind carried faint flakes that turned the valley ghostly. Naomi worked beside him in silence, clearing snow from the small corral, sweeping the porch with a branch broom. When she stopped to rest, she noticed how the snow clung to his skin and melted there, how the steam rose off his shoulders like smoke. She looked away quickly, ashamed of the strange warmth that followed. Inside, she tried to busy herself. She found beans, dried roots, and a few strips of venison hanging by the rafters. She remembered how her mother had cooked in Kansas. Slow stew simmering all day, filling the air with something close to peace. She tried to do the same, adding water to a pot and stirring, careful not to waste anything. The scent that rose was thin but comforting. When Taji returned, she gestured to the pot with a shy, uncertain smile. "I thought I'd cook for once." He leaned down, sniffed, then nodded. "It's good." She exhaled, half laughing. "You didn't even taste it." "I don't have to," he said simply. She laughed again, softer this time. "That's not how tasting works." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. When they ate, she noticed he chewed slowly, eyes distant. "You live here all alone?" she asked. He swallowed, looked toward the window where snow drifted. "Yes." "For how long?" He didn't answer. She waited, then turned her gaze to the fire. "I used to think being alone meant freedom," she murmured. "But it's just noise in your head that never stops." He stirred the embers with the end of his knife, his voice low. "Silence is honest. People are not." She looked at him carefully, the way his jaw tightened when he said it. "Someone hurt you." He met her eyes, and for a moment she wished she hadn't spoken. Then he said, "Everyone hurts everyone if they live long enough." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that kindness still existed, that not everyone was cruel. But she remembered the fire that took her family, the laughter of the men who left her for dead, and she couldn't find the words. The storm returned that night. Wind pressed against the walls, and the roof moaned like something alive. Naomi sat by the hearth, sewing the torn hem of her dress with a bone needle she'd found in a drawer. Her fingers shook. The firelight painted her face gold, and for the first time Taji looked at her, as though she weren't a trespasser, but a living thing the world had bruised too deeply. "You should rest," he said. She smiled faintly. "You always tell me that." He watched her a moment longer. "Because you don't listen." The silence that followed was gentle. She continued sewing, and he stared into the fire. Outside, wolves howled faintly across the valley, their voices long and mournful. Naomi shivered, but not from the cold. "They sound lonely," she said. "They're calling their kin," he replied. She looked at him. "Do you still have yours?" His gaze didn't move from the flames. "They were taken." She understood enough not to ask more. The words "taken" and "lost" carried the same shape in her chest. Later, when she rose to add wood to the fire, she stumbled slightly. His hand caught her elbow. For a heartbeat they stood close, her breath mingling with his, the sound of wind wrapping the cabin like cloth. His eyes were not cruel, not soft either, just deeply human. She whispered, "You don't have to keep me here. When the storm ends, I'll go." He released her arm slowly. "Where?" She opened her mouth, but no answer came. There was nowhere. No kin, no home, no world waiting. Only snow. He stepped back, nodding once as though confirming something to himself. "Then stay until you decide." She stared at him, unsure if it was kindness or command again. But something in his tone, in the weary steadiness of it, made her want to obey. She sat back down, eyes blurring from heat and exhaustion. The next day, the storm cleared. Sunlight spilled across the valley like melted silver. Naomi ventured outside, wrapping herself in one of his furs. The air was sharp, clean, endless. She saw the mountains clearer now, their white peaks rising like ancient watchers. Taji was kneeling near a stream, washing his knife. She watched the water run red for a moment, before realizing it was only the reflection of the sky. When he stood, he carried a bundle of dried reeds and small stones. He arranged them in a circle beside the cabin and began to hum, a low, rhythmic chant that made the air vibrate. Naomi stood behind him, curious but hesitant. "What are you doing?" "Speaking to the ones before," he said. She nodded, though she didn't understand. "Do they listen?" He glanced over his shoulder, eyes catching hers. "When you've lost enough, yes." She wanted to tell him she didn't believe in ghosts, but his tone left no room for disbelief. So she stayed quiet, letting the rhythm of his hum fill the cold. That night, she dreamed of fire again. But this time when she turned, she saw Taji standing in the smoke, offering his hand. When she woke, she was crying quietly into the fur. The fire was low, and Taji was gone. Outside, dawn broke in a thin blue line. She stepped into the light and froze. Across the field, faint figures on horseback were moving toward the valley. 3, maybe 4. Her heart stumbled. The memory of riders returned like claws. She turned back toward the cabin just as Taji emerged from the woods, bow in hand, snow clinging to his hair. "They're coming," she whispered. He didn't even glance toward the ridge. "I know." Her breath caught. "Who are they?" He looked past her, toward the horizon, where the riders cut through the light. "Old trouble," he said quietly. The wind shifted, carrying the echo of hooves. Naomi clutched the doorframe as he walked past her, his face unreadable. "They'll find you here," she said. He gave her a single look, calm and absolute. "Then let them." By noon, the snow had thinned to a gray drizzle, and the riders came into view. 4 men on mud-caked horses, their coats torn, their laughter sharp as knives. Naomi froze at the window, her fingers digging into the sill. Taji didn't move. He watched them with a kind of stillness that made the air itself hesitate. His bow leaned against the wall, untouched. "Stay inside," he said. But she couldn't. Fear was a living thing in her throat. She recognized one of the faces, the man with the scarred jaw who'd kicked her husband as the wagon burned. Her breath vanished. "Taji," she whispered. "They're the ones." He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. No surprise, no anger, just quiet recognition. "I know their kind." The riders halted outside, boots sinking in slush. Their leader, a heavy man with a red scarf around his neck, spat into the snow. "Well, look who's crawled out of the hills," he called. "Didn't know ghosts still kept cabins." Taji stepped into the doorway, bare chest streaked with ash from the hearth. "You've come far," he said evenly. The man laughed, tugging his horse's reins. "Heard you've been harboring a pretty thing. Pale, with green eyes. Thought we'd see for ourselves." Naomi pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding so hard she thought the sound would give her away. Taji's expression didn't change, but something colder entered the air. "You won't find what you're looking for," he said. The man smirked. "I think we already did." He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching over ice. "You used to be a fighter, Greyhawk. Now you're keeping house." Taji's jaw tightened. "Go." The others dismounted too, circling the cabin like wolves. One of them kicked the stacked woodpile, laughing. Naomi caught a glint of a rifle barrel. She backed away from the window, trembling. "They'll kill you," she whispered through the door crack. Taji turned his head slightly toward her voice. "Not if you stay silent." He stepped forward into the open snow, bare feet sinking. The wind tugged his white hair loose, framing the hard lines of his face. The men stopped laughing. There was something about the way he stood, calm, unafraid, that stole their humor. The leader lifted his rifle halfway. "Last warning, old man." Taji's eyes met his. "Then you already know what comes next." The rifle shook slightly. No one fired. The silence stretched until even the horses began to snort nervously. Then, muttering curses, the leader jerked the reins and spat again. "Not worth the trouble. Let's go. Ain't no woman here worth dying for." They rode off into the gray hills, their laughter trailing thinly behind them. Naomi sagged against the wall, trembling. Taji didn't move until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin, snow clinging to his skin like dusted silver. "They'll return," she whispered as he entered. He nodded once. "Yes." She stared at him, eyes wide. "Then what will we do?" He poured water from a clay jug, washing the dirt from his hands. "You'll go to town. They won't follow there." "No," she said suddenly, the words startling them both. "I'm not leaving you." He paused mid-motion, studying her. "You don't owe me anything." She stepped closer, voice trembling. "You gave me life when I had none. That's debt enough." His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "Debts make chains, Naomi. I don't want that for you." The sound of her name in his voice made her heart ache. "I can't run again," she whispered. "Not from them. Not from myself." He said nothing, only turned back to the fire. The room smelled of wet wood and smoke, of something human and raw. Naomi sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around her knees. Outside, the sky dimmed again, clouds thick as unspoken grief. By dusk, the storm had returned full force. The wind screamed across the valley, battering the cabin walls. Naomi tried to sew another tear in her skirt, but her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. Taji sat opposite her, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "Tell me about your family," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "Why?" "Because silence will eat you faster than grief." Her lips parted, then closed. The words came slowly. "My husband, Eli, was kind. Foolish sometimes, but gentle. He believed the land could love us back. My sister, she was 16. Always singing. I ran when they fell." Her voice cracked. "I didn't even look back." Taji's eyes met hers across the fire. "You lived," he said. She shook her head. "I ran." "Sometimes that's the same thing." She wanted to believe him. The warmth of the fire blurred her vision, and before she could stop herself, tears rolled silently down her face. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her, but his presence filled the room with quiet steadiness. Later, when the wind eased, he rose and pulled open a small chest from the corner. From it, he took a folded cloth, dark red, lined with beadwork faded from age. "This belonged to my wife," he said, "before the soldiers burned our camp." Naomi hesitated. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Don't be. She's with the mountains now." He placed the cloth on the table. "You'll need this when you go." Her hand brushed the fabric. It was soft, worn smooth by years. She swallowed. "Do you still dream of her?" He looked into the fire. "Every night. Some things you don't stop seeing." Naomi's eyes lowered. "Then we're the same," she said. For a while neither spoke. The storm beat against the walls like fists. Then Taji said, "Tomorrow we ride to town. You'll be safer there." She turned toward him sharply. "They'll judge me." "They already do." The truth of it cut deeper than kindness could. She clenched her hands in her lap. "And you?" "They'll look at you and see a savage." He shrugged. "Let them. Their eyes don't change who I am." She studied him through the firelight, how the shadows carved his features into something almost mythic. Half man, half spirit. "You don't care what they think?" "I stopped caring when caring killed everything I loved." Her breath caught at that, the quiet devastation behind it. She wanted to reach across the table, to bridge that gulf of pain, but his stillness warned her off. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dim. When she lay down that night, the storm softened again. She thought she heard him whisper something in his old tongue. Low, rhythmic, like a promise or a prayer. Sleep pulled at her gently, but unease sat heavy beneath it. At dawn, the world was a pale blue hush. Taji was already saddling the horses, his old mare and a smaller roan he'd tamed years before. Naomi stood in the doorway, wrapping the red cloth around her shoulders. The valley glittered under fresh snow, deceptively peaceful. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. He tightened the saddle strap. You said you were done running. She nodded, climbing onto the roan. They rode in silence down the narrow trail, their breaths white in the cold. The town smoke rose faintly miles away, a thin gray line against the horizon. As they neared the ridge, Naomi looked back at the cabin, their small sanctuary swallowed by distance, and felt something shift inside her. Not safety, not yet, but belonging of a kind she hadn't known since childhood. Then, from behind them, came the echo of hooves. Taji halted, eyes narrowing toward the trees. The sound was faint but growing. Naomi turned, heart pounding. Is it them? He didn't answer. His hand went to the bow strapped across his back, his expression unreadable. The wind carried the faint creak of leather, the whisper of another presence moving through the white. Ride on, he said quietly. Don't look back. But Naomi couldn't obey. She turned anyway, and saw a flicker of movement between the pines, dark shapes closing in, silent this time. Taji's voice came low, steady, like the calm before thunder. It seems the ghosts have found us again. The wind moved like a whisper through the trees, carrying the sound of hooves that grew clearer, heavier. Taji's hand rested on the bowstring, eyes fixed on the dark line of riders breaking through the snow haze. Naomi felt her pulse in her throat. The cold bit at her skin, but fear burned hotter than fire. 4 riders again, maybe the same, maybe worse. The memory of her husband's scream flashed, and she gripped the reins until her knuckles whitened. Go, Taji said softly, never looking at her. I won't, she whispered, shaking her head. Not again. He turned his gaze to her, calm and absolute, a storm behind still water. You'll go. No, she said, louder this time. If they take you, I'll. He cut her off with a gesture, eyes narrowing. You'll live. Then the first rifle cracked. The sound split the cold air, echoing across the ridge. Naomi ducked instinctively, her heart stuttering. A puff of snow burst near Taji's feet. He moved, not fast, not panicked, but deliberate, like a man whose body remembered war. He unslung his bow, notched an arrow, and drew in one smooth motion. The arrow flew, slicing the air. One of the riders fell backward off his horse, a dark blot on white. The others hesitated, realizing the ghost in the hills wasn't unarmed after all. Taji moved toward the rocks, silent as shadow. Naomi dismounted, crawling behind a fallen trunk. You can't fight them alone, she hissed. He didn't answer, only loosed another arrow. It struck the snow beside a rider's horse, scattering the animal and throwing its rider off balance. The man cursed, firing wildly, bullets snapping through branches. Splinters grazed Naomi's cheek. She pressed her hand to her face, the warmth of blood shocking against the cold. Her mind screamed run, but her heart wouldn't let her leave him. She watched Taji step from cover, broad and steady, every movement a defiance of age and pain. The last 2 riders regrouped, their leader shouting curses. Then Naomi did something she didn't understand until after she'd moved. She rose from behind the trunk, grabbed the fallen rifle beside the dead rider, and aimed, clumsy, shaking, terrified. Her finger hesitated on the trigger, breath burning her throat. She'd never shot anything before, not even for food. The leader saw her and grinned through his beard. You again, he called. Thought we'd buried your kind. She pulled the trigger. The sound slammed through the valley. The man's grin vanished. His hat flew off, snow puffed behind him. She missed, but he flinched, ducking low, buying Taji the moment he needed. The Apache's arrow struck true this time, cutting through the man's scarf and throat in one motion. He fell soundlessly into the snow. The last rider fled, the hooves fading into distance. Silence returned, broken only by the wind's hollow cry. Naomi lowered the rifle slowly, her hands trembling so badly she dropped it. Taji stood motionless, chest heaving faintly, bow still drawn though there was no target left. The world felt suspended, time fragile as frost. Then his hand went to his side. Blood welled through his fingers, dark against the white. No, she breathed, rushing to him. No, no, no. He sank to one knee, not from weakness but exhaustion. It's nothing, he murmured. You're bleeding, she said, pressing her scarf against the wound. You're hurt. He met her eyes. It's the price. For what? She whispered. For keeping the ghosts away. Tears blurred her vision. I won't let you die here. He almost smiled. You talk like you can stop the winter. She ignored him, tugging at her cloak, tearing it in two to wrap his side. Her hands shook, but her will didn't. Hold still. He obeyed, watching her work, the pain tightening his features but not his voice. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, breathing hard. You shouldn't have stayed for me. He looked toward the mountains. Maybe I stayed for myself. The words lingered between them, soft as smoke. By the time the sun began to fade, they'd built a small fire behind a rock outcropping. Naomi fed it scraps of wood and grass, her fingers stiff with cold. Taji leaned against the stone, eyes half closed. The world around them seemed impossibly quiet after so much noise. They'll come back, she said finally. With more men. Then they'll find nothing here, he replied. She turned to him sharply. You mean to leave? He opened his eyes, the fire reflecting in them like molten amber. You should go to town. Tell them what happened. Take the horse. I told you I'm not leaving. He exhaled slowly, gaze turning distant. You think the town will forgive you for being found with me? I don't need their forgiveness. He smiled faintly, pain twisting it. Then you're stronger than most I've met. She looked at him, the white hair, the scarred chest, the blood seeping through his side, and saw not the man others feared, but one carved from everything she'd lost. Endurance, silence, love unspoken. You could come with me, she said quietly. He didn't answer. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the blue dusk. Please, she said. Don't die out here alone. His hand brushed the earth beside him. This is my home. The mountain knows my bones. Naomi's throat tightened. Then let me stay. He looked at her finally, eyes searching. You don't belong to this world, Naomi. Neither do you, she whispered. That silenced him. The snow hissed in the fire's heat, melting into rivulets. The smell of pine and smoke mingled with iron. She reached out, laying her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm still. I was lost before I found your door, she said. If I leave now, I'll be lost again. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, not empty. It carried everything that couldn't be spoken. The grief of their dead, the years gone, the fragile miracle of surviving long enough to see each other. As night deepened, Naomi sat awake, listening to his breathing slow. She wanted to pray, but no words came. Only a wish, that dawn would find them both still here. When morning broke, pink light spilling over the ridge, the valley looked reborn. Fresh snow glittering like powdered glass. Naomi stirred, stiff from the cold. The fire had burned low. For a moment, she thought he was gone. Then Taji's voice came, faint but steady. You should see it, he said. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, wrapped in her torn cloak, staring toward the horizon. What? She asked. He nodded toward the east. Smoke rose there, thin but unmistakable, town smoke. They're coming, he said. Naomi's pulse quickened. The men? He shook his head. No. The town. They found the bodies. She joined him, eyes wide. They'll think that I did it, he finished quietly. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The world tilted, fragile as glass. Then we have to go, she said. Now. Taji's gaze stayed on the smoke. Running won't change what they believe. Then I'll tell them, she said fiercely. I'll tell them the truth. He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the faint glimmer of something unguarded. Hope, or maybe sorrow too deep for names. Truth, he murmured, isn't what they're coming for. The wind shifted, carrying the far-off echo of voices, angry, rising. Naomi's heart thudded painfully. She looked toward the sound, then back at him. He stood unmoving, the mountain at his back, the dawn breaking red across the snow. And in that fragile, crimson light, she finally understood. This was where his ghosts ended and hers began.